Welcome to Excel Basics number 2. This is our second introduction to Excel. And in this video, we'll see how to create formulas, formula inputs. We'll talk about Excel's golden rule, and we'll build a chart. Now, this is part of the Office 2016 series. This is video number 14. Now, here's the end result. We need a net income projection or budget, and we need to make this chart here. Then, if we change any of the formula inputs, whether or not it's the start revenue for January, the assumed revenue increase, or the expense percentage, everything in our projection will change, and the chart will update also. So that means the goal of this video is to create a net income projections table and chart that allows easy update. Now, here's all the topics we're going to cover. Now, I want to remind you, at our class website, and this link is below the video, there are awesome PDF notes for all the Excel basic videos in this series. If you download all of these, collect them together, it's like an awesome free book. Now I'm going to close this, and here's our system of folders. There's our O4 Excel folder, and there's the Excel workbook that we created in our last video. Now we're going to go down and click the green X to open up a blank Excel workbook. I'm going to click, hit enter, or escape to get my blank workbook. Now, last video we learned that we have columns, rows, cells. We can have lots of worksheets. All the worksheets make up the workbook. But another word that people often use to describe this Excel file is a spreadsheet. Now, that word spreadsheet could mean your actual Excel workbook, or it can mean an individual sheet. That is a loose synonym when we're using Excel. So we're going to save our spreadsheet or our workbook file by hitting F12. We're going to navigate down to video files, and there's our O4 Excel. We're going to click in File Name, and we're going to continue our naming convention, EB for Excel Basics 02, because this is the second video, dash. Net income projections, that file extension is fine. I can either click that save or hit enter to enact that save button. I'm going to hold control and roll my wheel to zoom in. Now, the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to type net income projections. And now I'm going to hit enter because I'm going to enter my labels into this column vertically. Now we type revenue, enter. Expenses, enter. Net. Now, the one thing you want to avoid, if I am not paying attention, if I type net income and then hit enter, oh, look at that. It thought I wanted the same word from above. So as soon as you start typing net income, you got to make sure to delete that end part. Later, we'll see when we're entering data like customer names over and over, that autocomplete will be quite handy. Now I'm going to hit enter, enter. Up here, we're going to actually create all of our formulas to calculate our revenue, expenses, and net income. But down here, we're going to build what's called an assumption table, or a list of our formula inputs. This is where our numbers will be that we change to then get all of our projections and our chart to change. So right in cell A6, I'm going to type assumption space, and then in parentheses, formula inputs, close parentheses. Enter. We're going to assume that the start revenue for January is going to be some amount. I type that in, enter. Revenue percentage increase. We'll have some percentage increase that we'll assume. We're also going to have an expense percentage that will always tell us our expense as a percentage of revenue. Now, enter. Now, I want to come up and change the column width here. Notice that column is not wide enough to accommodate all of these different labels. And I want to point between A and B. We could see that downward pointing cursor right there. That would highlight the whole column. But right in between that cursor, we've actually seen that cursor before in Windows Explorer when we were changing column width. So I'm going to click and drag. And I'm actually looking right down here. That expense as a percentage of revenue is the widest item I want fit in this column. This is OK to hang over because we're actually going to center this label over two different cells. We'll do that in just a moment. Now I want to come up to cell B1 and type JAN. Now my goal is to put this in the cell and keep the cell selected, so I Control Enter. I wanted to keep it selected because immediately we're going to use our fill handle. And as I move my selection cursor, our crosshair or angry rabbit to click and drag. I want to increment months. I'm going to drag all the way to the F column. And just like that, Excel automatically knows to increment the months. Now in G1, I'm going to type total and enter. Now we want to do a little bit of stylistic formatting. I'm going to click in any one cell in this top table. And last video we learned that we absolutely could use our selection cursor to click and drag to highlight because we want to add borders to everything. Or we can simply, if we have one cell in our table selected, we can use the keyboard Control asterisk. Now I use the asterisk on my number pad, or you can use Control-Shift-8. Now I got to show you something. I didn't show you this last video when I showed you this keyboard. If I'm out in the middle of nowhere land and use Control asterisk, it does not work. It doesn't know where the data is. If I click in any one of these cells, when I use Control asterisk, it searches in all directions until it runs into completely empty cells, and that's how it knows how to stop. One other thing, which is a potential pitfall, if you Control 8 because you forget to hit the Shift key, you'll see this message right here. Control 8 is the keyboard for outline symbols, which is something we don't get to see in this class. All right, so Control asterisk. Now, I can either come up to the font group, drop down, and point to all borders, or I can right-click, and there's my mini toolbar. I can click the drop down and select all borders. Now I want to highlight January all the way to total using my selection cursor. Now I'm going to hold Control and select from the middle of cell A2 down to A4. That Control selection trick is very handy because we're going to add the same formatting to all of these labels. Right-click, mini toolbar drop down for the paint bucket, and we're going to choose Fill Color Dark Blue. Now I'm going to select Font Color White. Now I'm going to select the top corner, right-click, Fill Color Yellow. You can add whatever colors you'd like. Now we're going to build our revenue and expense and net income formulas all based off of 1, 2, 3 different numbers. That way we can change one of the numbers and everything will update. Our assumed start revenue for January, that will be that cell right there, will be 5,000. 5,000 and enter. Our assumed revenue percent increase, we're going to start by typing a number. Later we'll add percentage number format, 1.05, enter. Our assumed expense as a percentage of revenue will be 0.65, and enter. Now I'd like to add some number formatting. I'm going to click in cell B7, and instead of using the number group up here, I want to open up the Format Cells dialog box. Now the Format Cells dialog box will give us many more options for number formatting and many more options for formatting cells. So with cell B7 selected, I'm going to use the keyboard Control-1. That opens up the Format Cells dialog box. Number tab, all sorts of amazing options that we will see throughout this series. Alignment, that allows you to add alignment. Font, border, we'll get to use this one later in this video. Fill, and even protection. Now let's go back to number. I want to click on currency. And in the last video, we used currency format from the number group. But the advantage to the Format Cells dialog box is there are hundreds of more options here. But just for this one example, I can choose to show different decimal places. I can choose a different monetary unit. We have it as dollar. I can also choose how to display my negative numbers. Now, because we're never going to have a start revenue that has pennies, I'm going to decrease. And look at this right here. There's always a sample. When you use Format Cells Number tab, it'll always give you a sample. So I can decrease, and it shows me a sample. That sample will come in handy when we do more complicated number formatting. I'm going to leave the dollar sign, and I kind of like the minus. If you're an accountant, you may like the parentheses to indicate a negative number. All right, I'm going to click OK. Now for our percentages, I'm going to highlight both cells, Control-1, come down to percentage. I'm going to choose 1 decimal. I can see the sample right there. Click OK or hit Enter. Now, I want to add some formatting to the top title here. So I'm going to select cell A6 to B6. Control-1 to open up Format Cells. I'm first going to start in the Alignment tab. Under Horizontal, I'm going to select Center Across Selection. Now, there's another way to center text up in the Alignment group. Oftentimes, people use that button, Merge and Center. If we're down here in the dialog box, that would be the check mark right there. I like Center Across Selection, and later in the class, we'll compare and contrast the two different options. I'm going to go over to Font, actually over to Fill first, because I want to fill this title with red. Because that's dark, I'm going to go back over to Font and select Font Color White. Now I want to go over to Border. And borders allow you to select a line, select the color, and then in essence, we draw our border over here. For this title, I'm going to accept the default for line and color. And I'm going to use the outline. Now notice outline has a dark border around the outside, but the inner lines don't get a border. For us over here, the outline is the outside. And we only have one inside line that won't get a border. So I'm going to select Outline, and there's our preview. All right, I've done number formatting, alignment, font, border, and fill. That is pretty convenient. Format Cells dialog box. Click OK or Enter. Now I want to highlight the remaining cells. Right-click, and on the mini toolbar, I'm going to select All Borders. All right, so we have our formula inputs or our assumptions. Now we can start building our formulas. The very first formula is easy. I just need to pull from the assumption area that 5,000. So I simply type an equal sign. Equal sign starts all formulas. Click on cell B7. I'm never copying this anywhere, so I don't need to worry about whether it's a relative or absolute cell reference, like we saw last video for the first time. So I'm going to hit Tab because the next formula we're going to create is for February. Now, for each successive month, I need to take the previous month's revenue and increase it by 5%. The way we can do that is we can take whatever the previous month's revenue is and multiply it by 1 plus the percentage increase. Now, when you see 105%, you can think of it as pennies, right? If I multiplied 5,000 times 100%, I get exactly 5,000. If I took 100% and multiplied it by $1, I'd get $1. But because we have 105%, if I were to multiply 105% times $1, I get exactly $1.05. So that means when we multiply this times our 5,000, it will take every dollar in there, and for every dollar, increase it by 5 cents. Now we're going to try our formula here, equals, and I'm either going to use my mouse to get my cell reference, or because I'm close, I'm going to use my left arrow. The previous month's revenue times multiplication symbol in Excel is a little asterisk, either Shift 8 or number pad multiplication. Now I'm going to click on cell B8. Notice when it was close, I used my arrow. When it was far away, I used my mouse. Now I'm going to just hit Control-Enter, and I want to talk about why that works. Now I hit pause and typed all of this out. If you download the finished version of this file, this will all be in the finished file. But I want to examine why in the world we're allowed to take 105%, multiply it by some start number, and we get the correct increase amount. That means we went from 5,000 to this amount, increasing the 5,000 by 5%. Now I did a simple example here. If we started with 100 and our increase percentage was 5%, then I can multiply those two and get $5 and finally add them. And I even did a formula here, right? It's just those two, that gives me the amount of the change or the increase. And then this simply is adding those two. Now I could rewrite this in a different form. 100 plus 100 times the 0.05. That would give me 100 plus the $5. And then that would be the total end amount. Because the idea is we're trying to get from that start amount to the end amount with the percentage increase. Now, if we rewrote this even further, this will fully illustrate why this formula is correct. 100 times 100 plus whatever the change is, the percentage or decimal. I could rewrite 100 right there as 100 times 1. Once I have that, that means I'm adding two things, and they both have times 100. So if you remember factoring from algebra, we're allowed to factor those out. And this is totally equivalent. 100 times whatever is left inside the parentheses. Remember, if we factor out the hundreds, we're left with 1 plus 0.05%. Then if we have that, we can simplify it even further. And there, that's the reason we're allowed to take 1.05 and multiply it by some start amount, or format it as a percentage and have 105% times some start amount, and always get the end amount. So that's what we did up here, 105% times the 5,000. Now we need to edit our formula up here, so I'm going to hit F2. And notice the cursor is touching that B8 cell. Now if I copied this over, it would not work, because the blue one would be relative. And that would work because when we get over to April, for example, I do need to look at the previous month, March, to get the begin amount or start amount. But B8, that needs to be locked. If I copy it right now, it's a relative cell reference. If I copy it over to March, that orange one would move to that empty cell right there. So I need to lock this before I copy it. I'm going to use the F4 key to lock it. Now I can Control-Enter, point to the fill handle, and with your angry rabbit, click and drag all the way to May. Immediately click in the last cell. Hit the F2 key. We're verifying that the blue one is a relative cell reference and that orange one is locked. That is beautiful. Tab. Now I want to add a total here. So I'm going to use my keyboard for the sum function, Alt equals. Now, we always want to make sure that the sum function guessed correctly, and it did. It got each one of the monthly revenues. Enter. Now, just to illustrate the beauty of Excel, I want to change the formula input. So start revenue for January is 5,000. But if I type 6,500, before I hit Enter, watch what happens here. As soon as I hit Enter, everything updates. That's absolutely beautiful. Now I'm going to Control-Z to undo that. Now, if our assumed 5% increase per month was different, I could simply type 1, 0. And I want you to notice something. That percentage symbol is sitting there. We've already formatted it, and it knows that it's a percentage. Now I'm going to type a 6 and enter. And just like that, everything updated. Now I'm going to Control Z. Later, when we make our chart, it'll be even better. All the numbers will update, and the chart will update also. Now we need our expense formula. And the way this works in budgeting is the accountants looked at historical records and estimated that on average, 65% of the total revenue for the month will be used up with expenses. Expenses are things like rent expense, wage expense, cost of goods sold expense. So we're going to use this 65%. All right, I'm going to click in cell B3, equal sign, up arrow, and this cell reference is going to be a relative cell reference. As we copy to the side, that blue cell needs to move to February, March, April, and so on. So I'm not going to lock it. Now I'm going to multiply that by, and there's our expense as a percent of revenue. Now, if I think about that, as I copy to the side, if I were to copy this right now to February, that cell reference would move because it's a relative cell reference. And I don't want that. Every single month, I need to look at whatever the monthly revenue is and multiply it by our 65%. So I'm immediately going to hit the F4 key. Now, Control Enter. Point to my fill handle with the Angry Rabbit, click and drag. I immediately click in the last cell in F2. I'm verifying that it got the correct May revenue, and it's still locked on our 65%. Now, another way to think of why this expense formula works, and this is a very common budget formula. We take our revenue and we multiply it by the percentage the accountants gave us. What this means is that for every $1 into the cash register, 65 pennies are spent on expenses. The remaining 35 pennies are left over for profit. All right, I'm going to hit Enter. Now our next formula is going to be net income. And net income is revenue minus expenses. So this formula, you equal sign, up arrow, minus up arrow. When your cell references are close, your arrow keys are going to be much faster than your mouse. Now our goal is to put this in the cell and keep the cell selected. So I Control Enter. I point to my fill handle, and with my Angry Rabbit, I click and drag. Now I just copied that formula over, so I have to go to the last cell and select it and use the F2 key to put it in edit mode. And I want to verify that the cell references are pointing to the correct location. And they are. May, revenue, and expenses. Now I want to revert back to what was in the cell before I put the cell in edit mode, so I use the escape key. Now I need to add all of the expenses to get our total expenses. So I select cell G3. So I Alt equals, then I verify that the cell references are correct, and Enter. Alt equals. Wow, look at that. That's why we always have to verify. That is not correct. Now remember, when the dancing ants are dancing, anywhere you go, you're still in edit mode. So simply click and drag, and when you have the correct number of cells, January to May net incomes, you hit Enter. Now we're ready for our chart. I'm very carefully going to select the labels January to May. So I click in B1 and drag all the way to May. Now I'm going to use my Control key. I do not want to highlight everything. I want to use Control and select just the net incomes. I have some labels and some amounts, and I want to visually compare these using a chart. Charts, I go up to the Insert ribbon tab. In the Chart group, I'm going to select the most common chart, the column chart. I'm going to click the drop down. We are not going to use 3D charts. 3D charts are almost always chart junk. And we want to select the top one, the 2D one that says clustered column. And just like that, we have a chart. Now I want to try and click on the outside edge because I need to move the chart. What you don't want to do when you're moving a chart is don't click on the inside elements because then you might move just those elements. I want to click on the outside edge, and when I see my move cursor, I can click and drag. Now let's resize it. I'm going to point to the little white circles and click and drag in. Now we're going to format this, but you know what? Before we format this, I'm going to click and drag off to the side. I would like to move all of this down lower in the spreadsheet. I'm very carefully with my selection cursor going to highlight, Control X to cut. Then I'm going to use my wheel to scroll down just a little bit. And somewhere down below, I'm going to select A25, Control V to paste. All right, now I'm going to use my wheel to scroll up. Point to the outside edge, and with my move cursor, click and drag. Now we want to format our chart. We can see the heights are continually going up. What I like to do first is add the actual amount above each column. And there's two main ways to do formatting. There are some options off to the side. We can add elements, format, and filter. We're going to use this one right here. We're going to click the green plus. And there's a number of items that we already have. Our axes, our chart title, and our grid lines. We want to check data labels. You could see by hovering, I already see them over there. But when I check, there they are. That's the first way we can add elements in format. I'll show you the second way in just a moment. Now, anytime you're looking at a chart and deciding what to add, what to format, what to delete, our guiding rule will be to ask of each chart element, is it chart junk? Now, what is chart junk? Chart junk is something that doesn't help you articulate your message. A simple example of chart junk is, well, I have some numbers here which are perfectly fine, but then I also have the numbers here. I probably don't need them in both places. By having them in both places, I'm cluttering up my chart. Now, I think I kind of like these amounts above the columns, so I'm very carefully going to click on the vertical axis. And when I see my solid line, I'm going to use the delete key to delete that axis. Now, grid lines, those are not necessarily chart junk, but really those are there to help you line up the numbers that were in our vertical axis. So I don't think we need those. Now, if you click on the outside edge, it highlights the very outside edge of all the elements in the middle of the chart. That's not what I want. So I'm going to click on one of the inside lines. And when I see those little teeny dots highlighting, then I can use the delete key to delete those. The next thing I'd like to do is format the columns. Now, when you select the columns in a chart, notice I clicked once and it highlighted all of the columns. That means I can format all the columns at one time. If I were to click a column a second time, then I highlight just that column, and I can format just that column. Now I'm going to click outside, click back. They're all selected. Now, just like when we're over in the cells in our sheet, we can use Control-1 to open up Format Cells dialog box. The same keyboard works inside of charts. But when we use Control-1, it will open up a task pane that allows us to format different elements. So I'm going to try it. Control-1. Now, we have the columns selected, so our task pane over here will offer us different formatting options. Now, the one thing that's a little bit confusing about the task pane is I see these icons at the top. Sometimes it's hard to find exactly what you want, but once the task pane opens, just you can click through the icons, and they open up different options. Now, for us, we might be able to guess that the bucket of paint is what we want. So I'm going to click on the bucket of paint. Now, the fill, I'm going to open up that little triangle. And here's some options. If we wanted to change the color, we'd say solid fill and then use the drop down. But what I want to try is vary colors by point. Once I check that, there it is. I get a different color for each column. If I wanted borders, I could click the triangle, click solid line, and then change the color. But that's how I'm going to leave it for now, vary colors by point. Now, as we look at our chart here, is there any chart junk? Well, the columns are OK. The labels are definitely OK. The amounts are OK. Yes, that's a terrible chart title. Now, I do want a chart title, and I actually want it to say 2017 net income projections. So watch this. We're actually going to link this chart title to the cell A1. And the way you link chart elements, whether it's a chart title or later we'll have axis labels, you make sure you select, in our case, the chart title. And don't click inside, because then you get those dotted lines and you can't link it. The dotted lines are fine. You could simply then highlight it and type. But that's not what we want. Make sure the solid line is selected. Then we come up to the formula bar and click, type an equal sign. And since we want whatever text is in cell A1, I click on cell A1. Now, it puts the cell reference in with the sheet name. I'm immediately going to hit Enter. And I can see right away it totally got the text from cell A1. Now, if I wanted to change this, I could come up and F2, put it in edit mode, and then click somewhere. And if I type net income, now I've changed whatever's in cell A1. As soon as I hit Enter, instantly our chart title updates. Now I'm going to Control-Z to undo that, Control-Z. Now let's resize the chart. I'm going to click on the outside edge, and with one of my white circles, I'm going to click and drag in. Now there's a great trick. If you point to the outside edge of your chart and drag, it simply drags. But now if you hold the Alt key, Alt, it will snap to the grid. And that's what I want. I want it to exactly snap to the line directly above row 6 and the line on the front edge of column D. Now, we have our formula inputs. We have our net income projections. And we have our chart. Now I want to come over. And I want you to notice we didn't type any numbers in here. The only numbers that are going to determine what our revenue, expenses, and net income are and the chart result are these three numbers. Now, by creating all these formulas and these charts based on these formula inputs, we are following Excel's golden rule. And that golden rule says for any one of your formulas, I'm going to put this in edit mode, tab, edit mode. We have a bunch of different formulas over here. For any one of these formulas, if the formula inputs can change, then you put them into a cell and label them. Then in your formulas, you refer to those formula inputs with cell references. And that's exactly what we did. And here's the magic of Excel's golden rule. We can come here, and the actual starting amount was 7,250. When I hit Enter, everything updates. The actual revenue increase was 106. Enter. Not only that, but we totally misheard the accountant. We thought they said 65%. They actually said 85%. So I'm going to change that to 85 and Enter. And instantly, everything updates. We have followed Excel's golden rule. Not only does that golden rule make it easy for us to change things and have our entire budget and chart update, but when we close this and open it up tomorrow or next week, it's very clear. It says formula inputs. We put the numbers, and we put labels. All right, the last step is to add page setup. If I Control-P, remember we always have to look over to our print preview. I definitely want to exclude all of this, and I want to add a footer and change this to landscape orientation. So escape. I'm going to go up page layout, page setup, dialog launcher, or Alt PSP. I want landscape. I'm going to guess again. Increase maybe 125%. Click margins. I'm going to center this horizontally. Header or footer. I'm going to come down to the footer, and right in the middle, I would like to have the actual Excel workbook name. So I click the insert file name. That's the secret code for always give me the file name. Then I'm going to type a space, dash, space. And then I'm going to put my sheet name. Now I'm going to click OK. Now we go over to Sheet. And I definitely want a print area. I'm very carefully going to select A1 all the way to H15. There it is. Now it will exclude all that other stuff that's not in that range. I'm going to click OK. Control P. I'm checking to see how it looks. It's looking great. Look at that. That is bad naming. I'm going to click Escape. It's for January to May 2017. So I'm going to come down, double click the sheet 1, and type 2017 space January to May, and enter. Now when I Control P, look at that. It's looking great. Now I'm not going to click Print. I'm going to click Escape and Save. The last thing we want to do is I'm noticing right here, I'm showing no decimals with number formatting. Here I'm showing 1 decimal. Over here I'm showing 2 decimals. So I'd like to be consistent. I'm going to highlight with my selection cursor all the cells, right-click. And on the mini toolbar, I'm going to increase decimals. Notice when I increase decimals, I see that they're all 1. Now you could decide whichever one you want. I'm going to leave it at 1 just so they're consistent. Escape. All right, in this video, we saw how to create a net income projection table using all formulas and our chart. Both of these items were pointing back to our assumption table, where we followed Excel's golden rule, put numbers that can change into the cells, and then labeled them, and saw how amazingly easy it is to simply change a number. And when I hit Enter, everything updates. Now, in our next video, we're going to talk about adding and counting, and we're going to see a bunch of cool formulas. And if you like this video, click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and be sure to sub, because there's always lots more videos from Excel is Fun. All right, we'll see you next video.